Does she want to be a mediator? No. She's really interested in international.
Yeah, international business. She's been working in business.
I see.
One of the classes she was in last year, she talked a little bit about what she was doing.
Yeah,
Really interesting, amazing.
yeah.
She's very articulate, right? She was talking about what she was doing, her experiences.
She's talked a lot more in her classes this way. I don't know why.
Yeah,
Well,
last
right.
year she talked tremendously. I mean, I was listening to something all in time. She was oh my.
Yeah.
Wait, oh, it's too bad.
Yeah.
Sarah.
He's talking
You're wrong.
And that sounds
The more and more I talk to Sarah, I realize she's one of those.
Thank you so much, my sister.
She's doing the whole day, kind of thing, and I'm thinking, to be young again. Work with what?
She's in my,
She's a full-time student.
I don't know if it's she's in my association. She's when I dressed in my suit. And I told you,
Yeah, that's a sex worker.
That's the new,
That's a new term.
politically correct.
Yeah, okay. It's best that we know these things.
You never know when you're going to
Never know.
very
Yeah. Well, she was telling me how they were trying to have a SWAT over how they feel in her house. Yeah. How it all works and everybody kind of, it's a very.
otherwise I could
They have.
the bar.
So that's why she's having the.
That's why she had that
okay.
party for Howard
Okay.
Dean.
Now, see, I didn't. I did too. I thought she was.
No, I did too. The only reason I can tell you this is because she did car insurance, and I said to her like last week, because so she called Mitch, and she was giving her a car in Watertown. So Mitch called one of the associates who was in Watertown, who met her when she got her car. And she said, yes, I had a car, and it was her and her boyfriend. And my first conversation, I was
Because I don't know about
Well, you kind of look at the. They're very open.
No way for me to express
Did I
any
get
points.
very short. I haven't seen her in anything since. She's very, very short hair. I think her name is Kristen also. But maybe I'm wrong. The class is very, very, very short. It must have been was that Aaron Grant's class. No, it was not at all. She was very average size. Kind of cute. 'Cause I remember thinking that she was there a little too trouble. Kristen, but she must have. It was an advanced class. I don't know why I was there.
I heard not matter now.
Where she is. She's like. Oh, okay.
Anne was right.
She's so oblivious. She says to me before we go out,
One of the most intractable problems in the world is the problem between China and Tibet. We've had problems between Israel and the neighbors. We've had problems between India and Pakistan, and right up along those, in terms of some of the most serious tensions in the world, have been between China and Tibet. In the last few weeks, we have had some new indications that there may be opportunities for discussions of that issue between the Chinese and the Tibetans. In the 1950s, there were very serious tensions. 1959, for a period of 6 months, there were an estimated, by Chinese figures, 87,000 Tibetans killed in an uprising, and many people went to Tibet, from Tibet to India at that time. And in the 1980s, there were a period of reforms, and then from the period of 87 to 89, there were again tensions and several hundred people killed before these uprisings were put down. And since that time, we have had continued tensions in Tibet. To help us discuss this issue today, we have 4 people, 2 Tibetans, 2 Chinese. From my left is Hu Xiaozhang, who received her PhD at Harvard very recently, and her thesis was on small businesses in Tibet, where she studied migrants who were coming into Tibet, often from the outside, as well as local business people. The next, to her left, is Lapsang Sangye, who has been at Harvard Law School for a number of years. His family originally fled from Qinghai, Sichuan. Pardon? Sichuan. Fled from Sichuan into India after the uprisings in 1959. And in recent years, he's been at Harvard in the law school studying the Tibetan issue. To his left is Pucheng Tsering. Pucheng Tsering was, his family fled from Tibet after the uprisings in 1959. He was educated in India, and he has been a member of the last 2 delegations of Tibetans that have gone to China for discussions. And to his left is Zheng Shiping, who came here as a Harvard Yenching Fellow in the early 1980s. Unfortunately, he got his PhD at Yale, but he spent 3 years on his dissertation while located at Harvard, and he lives in the Harvard community, and his wife is employed by Harvard. I'd like to start off with a question of what's the background for this new period of hope? And is it really something that's likely to lead to something? And to start us off on that question, I'd like to call on Mr. Tsering, who is a member of the delegation that went with Lodi Gary into China, and ask him about the background of that delegation and whether he thinks there's much hope that this might lead to some kind of negotiated settlement between the Tibetans and the Chinese. Mr. Tsering.
Thank you. I think if we look at the recent history, the present process began sometime in the late 1978 when emissaries of the then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping met with the elder brother of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And then in February of 1979, the elder brother was invited to Beijing to talk with Deng Xiaoping, and there Deng Xiaoping made a commitment. He said that if the Tibetan side can avoid talking about the independence of Tibet, then all issues can be discussed and resolved. And so the process began from that. That was a good time because His Holiness the Dalai Lama had already begun thinking about the future of Tibet in a way he thought would be of interest to both the Tibetans and the Chinese. You know that after 1959, the Tibetan struggle, one of the main objectives of the Tibetan struggle was the regaining of independence of Tibet. But then His Holiness realized that more than the physical independence of Tibet, the survival of Tibetan culture and identity was very important, and therefore he said that if the Tibetan culture and identity can survive within the framework of the People's Republic of China, he would be willing to settle for that. And he not only said that, but he also made preparations in the Tibetan community, and he began a process whereby today the Tibetan people are, at least a majority of them, even if they feel internally that we have made some compromise, they agree to His Holiness's reason for his what is called the middle way approach. And since that time, there have been series of fact-finding delegations sent by the Tibetan government in exile to China and Tibet. And in 1982 and 84, two high-level delegations made exploratory trips to Beijing. And last year, in September and in May, June this year, envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama went to Beijing. So this is the sort of development from the Tibetan perspective so far. And I think the Chinese government under Deng Xiaoping realized that the Tibetan issue was a problem and that they, if have to resolve it, then they have to take into consideration the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan leadership, who all Tibetans believe are the legitimate representatives of the Tibetan people.
I would ask Shiping or Xiaojiang, what do you think the Chinese expect to get from these? Do you think they're really serious about negotiation? What would they want from the negotiation before they could get any agreement?
I think for quite a while, I thought the Chinese government, the best weapon for the Chinese government to deal with the Tibetans in exile is just not to talk to them, because I think time is on the side of the Chinese government, and they can simply wait. They have been waiting for the last 40 years, and it seems to be that China is gaining the upper card. But now, I think the Chinese government is willing to talk. I think probably there are 2 or 3 factors. One fact is that I think the Chinese government is becoming more confident in dealing with foreign countries, in dealing with the world. Chinese foreign policy has shown a lot of new elements, new intentions to accommodate different ideas and different designs. China is becoming much better in understanding the world, in understanding the concerns, the opinions of the outside world, and therefore I think the Chinese government is no longer afraid of talking about the Tibetan issue to the world. So that might be one of the reasons. The other reason, of course, we might speculate is that now we have a new leader in China, the president, who is also the party chief, Mr. Hu Jintao, who used to be the party chief in Tibet. Does he play a role? Of course, we don't know for sure, but we might speculate that he might play some kind of role, because he certainly is one of the top Chinese leaders who knows the most about the Tibetan issues. And finally, I would say that probably the Dalai Lama in the last 2 or 3 years, because he has come out and publicly said that he has now given up the hope for independence. He is basically seeking for autonomy. That opens the door for the Chinese government. So the Chinese government, I think, is very interested in knowing the details. Right now, we are no longer talking about the slogans or the rhetoric. We need to move on to the details. Okay, when you talk about full autonomy, what exactly do you mean? What are you asking? And what can the Chinese government possibly give you? And in giving you the full autonomy, what can you bring into China? What benefits can you give to China? I mean, when you talk about 2 parties negotiating, we have to talk about take and give. What can you take, what can you give? So I think probably it's the details that will be the challenge for both sides in the future.
If the China is not afraid, why are they so reluctant to have Dalai Lama come? Xiaojiang, do you want to comment on that, or should I go to Shiping?
I don't think it's really a question of afraid. I think for a long time it has been there's idea, the belief there's no gain in for his to come back. Because as Professor Zheng just mentioned, there are several reasons, because the time kind of losing, time is not really on the side of the Tibetan side. But I do not think that is what I just said was just general idea by some of the Chinese government officials, but I do not really agree with that. I think the Chinese government should negotiate with Dalai Lama, not really by saying who afraid of who, but more on how much we can gain and how much both sides can gain.
One of the problems in dealing with the Tibet is whether to have Tibet as an autonomous region, but a lot of the Tibetans point out that maybe 3 million Tibetans are in Tibet, and maybe 3 million are in other areas like Qinghai, Sichuan, Yunnan, and what happens to those Tibetans? And Lapsang, since you were from one of those areas, you are undoubtedly very close to those people in Sichuan and Qinghai and outside of Tibet. Even if the Chinese should make some concessions on Tibet to give it more autonomy on culture, what would happen to the people outside and what should be done to the people outside?
It seems Chinese government fear that if you give all the 3 provinces of Tibet as one unit, then their calculation is that
the 3 meaning Sichuan,
That's true.
Qinghai, and Tibet?
What Chinese call Tibet is Tibet Autonomous Region. And then there are other areas adjacent to Tibet Autonomous Region in Yunnan, Gansu, Qinghai, and Sichuan, where Tibetan people live are what we call traditional Tibet. Now, Chinese government fear is that if you combine all this area and give as a chunk of the area to Tibetan people, they might use it as a platform for future independence. So they think that this territory gain and autonomy is a springboard for future independence. But I would like to challenge this notion based on 2 facts. First, there are 5 autonomous regions in China. One is Xinjiang Autonomous Region, Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region, Zhuang Autonomous Region, Ningxia Autonomous Region, and Tibet Autonomous Region. These are the 5 major minorities, so-called minorities, who are provided regions to be administered autonomously by the respective minorities. Now, in Xinjiang Autonomous Region, almost 90% of the Uyghur live in one area, and Chinese government found it okay to have Xinjiang have the whole region. And in Inner Mongolia, almost like 70 to 80% of Mongolians live in one area, because Mongolians are scattered in Xinjiang area and Qinghai. That's why wherever they're living in one area, they're given the autonomous region. In Zhuang, 90% of the Zhuang live in one area, and they are given one autonomous region. And Ningxia Autonomous Region is mainly for Hui Muslims. Hui, as you all know, is scattered all over China, but wherever they're living in concentrated community, that's in Ningxia area, they're given one autonomous region. Now, compared to all these 4 minorities, it's only Tibetan people who are divided into 5 parts. And in that sense, Tibetans are denied even basic rights that is being enjoyed or provided to other minorities. That's one thing. Second thing is, if you read the Chinese Constitution, Article 5 of the Chinese Constitution, or Minority Nationality Act, Article 2, says that wherever minorities are living in concentrated community, they are entitled to have an autonomous region. Based on that law, Chinese government implements law and has implemented this law in all the other 4 autonomous regions. Only in Tibet they have not. In that sense, Chinese government has violated their own constitution and Minority Nationality Act by dividing Tibetans into 5 areas. Now, and then they fear that by giving Tibet a chunk of area together, it might be used as a springboard for other goals. Is unfounded, because this has not happened in Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Zhuang, and Ningxia. Hence, the Chinese government fear is unfounded. Actually, in that sense, Tibetan people deserve to live together and to administer themselves as one unit.
Does that mean that the boundaries of Tibet should be enlarged to include all those other areas, or does that mean there should be semi-autonomous subregions, like county-level semi-autonomous regions, say, within Sichuan and Qinghai?
I think all the Tibetan people living in that area should be under one administrative unit for various reasons.
No matter where in China they are living, even if they're not contiguous?
They all are in one concentrated community. Mm-hmm. If you look at the ethnic map of China, mm-hmm. you will see that Tibetans are in one region, a Tibet Autonomous Region, and adjacent areas of Sichuan, Gansu, Yunnan, and Qinghai. Those areas where Tibetans are living together as a unit should be in one administrative unit. That's what I feel.
Shirping, do you think that would be acceptable to the Chinese to have
I think
area enlarged?
Lama and I have been debating on this Tibet issue for many, many years, and we used to debate about history of Tibet. We used to debate about historical status, whether Tibet was ever independent or was ever part of China. We debate about many of those issues. I think probably we should go on beyond those debates, because currently we are really talking about what's move on. Because I don't think it's possible for the Chinese government to change the boundaries, and I think this Great Tibet idea is just outdated, and there is no way to bring it back. And talking about it is just wasting time. And if you want to talk about it, and the Chinese government say that, okay, you talk about it, I don't want to talk to you about it.
Mr. Tsering?
I think we might find a solution if we look at the issue from a different perspective. Right now, I think we are trying to look at the Tibetan issue and the emotions surrounding it through the perspective of what's called quote-unquote Tibet. But if we change that focus and put emphasis on the Tibetan people, which the Dalai Lama himself does, he says the survival of the Tibetan people is the important part. And since His Holiness is now willing to reach on a solution which is within the framework of the People's Republic of China, I don't see why there can't be any accommodations or any changes in the situation, because in the past, Professor, I think you might know that Chinese administrative limitations have been changed in certain other areas for certain needs, and therefore if the Chinese government, which they say they believe really respect Tibetan culture and are very sympathetic to the fact that the Tibetan people's culture is important, there can be ways the survival of the Tibetan people as a whole. How it is done is a matter of discussion, but that's important. I think if the Chinese people start accepting that fact, then they, I think, will have a different perspective of what's called Greater Tibet, because if you just look at the term Greater Tibet, it's very sinister. But if you look at from the Tibetan people's perspective, we're talking about the survival of our people, and I think that can be accepted.
If we try to think of a positive way of framing the issue that would be acceptable to both sides, then cultural autonomy and having a certain amount of opportunity to preserve Tibetan culture is something that the Chinese could probably accept. I'd like to hear everybody's reaction to that. And now the Dalai Lama has said we can accept the political authority of China, but we would like to have a certain amount of autonomy. If that can serve as a framework, then the question is, what defines the independent culture? What defines the overall political authority of China? Is that kind of analysis possible to have? Do I understand the framework correctly? Is that something all four of you can accept? Is that general idea that we will have autonomy of the culture, but that there would be political authority of China? Is that general love song?
As Zheng Xiaoping said, the demarcation of border is not possible. We have to move on. It's easy to say, but Chinese government has demarcated various regions of China quite recently. And as you have written a book on 4 special economic zones, and Chinese government carved out these regions out of Guangdong provinces. They found it fine to have a separate and special administrative region or special economic zones for Chinese people. And if I'm correct, the Chongqing city, right, I think in the Sichuan has been carved out new. So it's okay for Han Chinese to carve out their own areas and have a special administrative unit and have special economic zones, but not for Tibetans. That's the question. There's this ethnic dimension to it, And also, they find it okay to have one country, two system for Hong Kong, for one country system for Macau, but not for Tibetan people. Again, comparatively, as far as Hong Kong, Macau, and special economic zones are concerned, their emphasis is on economy. Hence, their autonomy is defined and designed for economy. Now, as far as Tibetan people are concerned, it's mainly the culture, that's true. It's our religion, our language, our custom, our tradition, It has to be protected in the interest of China's diversity, in the interest of the, in the humanity as a whole. So in that sense, yeah, why can't we have one administrative unit whereby Tibetans can administer themselves, what language they speak, what education they have, what kind of economy, environment, policies that they can have. So I think that there is an easy way to find a solution, because the main demand or the concern of the Chinese government is that splitting the motherland. Sovereignty is the main issue. Now, having Dalai Lama agreed that Dalai Lama is for one China, that he wants to resolve the issue within the parameter of Chinese constitution. Now everything else should be flexible, because we have fulfilled the main demand of the Chinese government. Now to say that even the administrative unit is not enough, or we can't demarcate, we cannot have culture, then it's like saying you cannot have anything, So you must show some flexibility and rationality, some reasonableness and moderation from Beijing side as well. I think as far as Dalai Lama is concerned, he has been as reasonable and as realistic as he could be in his proposals.
Mr. Tsering, you were there recently. What was the situation as you observed it in terms of how much cultural autonomy the people in Tibet have? Is the culture being preserved now? or is the culture not being preserved?
Let me preface this by saying that when we went on these 2 trips, the main focus wasn't to see how the situation was there in the area. It was more to, as the envoys themselves have said, to re-establish contact with the Chinese leadership. And that they have succeeded in doing so. In terms of what we have seen so far, we see that there is the existence of Tibetan society. There is this effort to sort of preserve and promote the Tibetan culture. But at the same time, we also visited many Chinese towns from Beijing to Shanghai. And we could see that there's a clear sort of difference between the atmosphere in the Tibetan areas and the atmosphere in the Chinese areas. In the Chinese areas, I'm very glad to say that Chinese people are becoming more open. There's more. In fact, we found one prominent musician in Yunnan criticizing the Chinese leaders openly, publicly. In the Tibetan area, leave alone seeing any of these tendencies. Tibetans were very much afraid even to get in touch with us. I think that is the sort of situation which oftentimes people outside don't notice. And while I'm at it, I think I want to add something. This whole process began with Deng Xiaoping's commitment that if you don't talk about independence, then you can talk about anything else, not just talk, you will be resolved. From the Dalai Lama's side, he has fulfilled his commitment about not talking about independence. Now, I think I leave it to the audience and to my Chinese friend to see if the Chinese side has fulfilled the commitment about discussing and resolving the issue.
Xiao Zhang, you've been in Tibet a number of times to do interviewing of people on the ground. To what extent do you feel there is Tibetan cultural autonomy and that Tibetan culture is alive and well? And to what extent is it restricted?
I think for most part, if we talk about Tibet Autonomous Region, that's TAR, there's the cultural element and the religious element is very tightly entwined with political issues. But if we talk about Tibetan culture in general, for example, like in Sichuan area, Qinghai area, and Yunnan area, in those parts, the culture issue and the religious issue was basically left like as free as they want. And the Dalai Lama's picture was allowed in public in Sichuan and in Qinghai because in those places, culture and religion was not tied into politics. It's not tied into the issue of independence. So I think as long as the whole culture issue and religious issue tied with this concern with independence, basically the concern of security, national security, then there's always kind of restriction on that level. But also I think if we move on to this modernization, then outsiders get into the region, and do they dilute the culture? Do they somehow contaminate the culture? I do not think so. I think culture is not a living fossil. It's not a fossil. It's a living thing. Culture always move, always change, always adapt. I think for example, in Lhasa, even though you have all this karaoke and the modern TV and all that, then you find people use this new modern media to, the Tibetan culture revived in some sense through this modern media. The Tibetan language, Tibetan music, I think is much more widespread than before without this modern media.
Mr. Tiering, I know the Dalai Lama feels that there are a lot of restrictions on the family practices of religion in Tibet. How serious do you think those restrictions are?
That's very much a concern for the Tibetan people even today, and I think quite contrary to what Hu Xiaozheng said just now. It's not just restricted to the Tibet Autonomous Region. Just recent days we have seen reports about how the Chinese authorities are clamping down on Tibetan monasteries and Tibetan institutions in what is called present-day Sichuan and Qinghai. In the Litang area in Kansi, what's called the Kansi Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. So I think there's a pattern whereby my personal feeling is that Chinese authorities are in a dilemma. If they can clearly rest assured that if the Tibetan people can be given cultural freedom, their religious freedom, that it will not mean some sort of sinister political division, then it will be to the good for the China itself. But right now, within, for example, in Lhasa, when we were there, it was quite clear that the people's cultural practices still being restricted or limited. Overall, the policy seems to be sort of to avoid any obvious signs of cultural domination, but in terms of control, the authorities want to maintain control.
One of the questions is if there were some kind of agreement that could be reached, can the Dalai Lama really represent all the Tibetans in India and all in the United States? As I understand, there are quite a few different groups here. And do you think that all the Tibetan groups could agree that if they were given more autonomy and cultural autonomy, that they could accept the Chinese political authority? Do you think there's a consensus among the Tibetan overseas community?
So much is made out of, there's differences between groups in exile, especially what they try to label is the radical youth and the Dalai Lama. But Puchung and myself, we got elected as youth leader in 1991 together, right?
I think so.
1991. So we were youth leaders, and you're looking at as someone who is agreeing with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, So it's easy to kind of have a stereotype image and try to kind of say that there is a division between the exiled Tibetans. Now, if Chinese government really wants to test whether Dalai Lama enjoys the loyalty and support of the Tibetan people, we welcome them to have referendum in Tibet. Let the Tibetan people in Tibet vote and choose whether they want and accept His Holiness the Dalai Lama as their leader or the Chinese government as their government. And we can guarantee that as high as 70, 80, almost 90% will vote to say that they will accept the leadership of Dalai Lama. Now, if Chinese government cannot take up this challenge, then they are implicitly agreeing that Dalai Lama is hugely popular in Tibet and he enjoys the support of the Tibetan people. Now, as for your previous question, that whether Tibetans enjoy autonomy, cultural autonomy or not, there are few evidence which can convincingly show that Tibetans don't. One is every year, thousands of Tibetans flee to India via Nepal, right? Thousands. Now, why would all these, people as young as 6 years to 60 years, they leave their parents, home, family, everything behind, walk in peak winter, cross Himalayan mountains, risk their lives, some die on the way, some lose their fingers, everything, cross over and come to India. Now, India's GDP is lower than China's. If they are for economic reason, then they should be going to Shanghai, or they could be flying to US. But why are they coming to India? To become an illegal alien, Why? Because they lack. The first thing they do is they go to either Tibetan monasteries in India or they go to Tibetan schools in India provided by Tibetan government exile. This is clear evidence that Tibetan people in Tibet do not really enjoy autonomy in sense of culture, in sense of education, even in sense of economy. Hence, they have to flee, risk their lives, and come to India. That's one evidence.
Shirping, do you feel there are really that many people who are fleeing, and if so, why?
Well, I think probably I would answer this question indirectly. I think on this issue, as I said again, said already, Chinese government right now has all the cards, time is on the side of the Chinese government. The fact that the Chinese government is willing to receive 2 delegations from the Tibetans exile is a very good sign. So this is the best opportunity we haven't seen in a long, long time. Let's not squander this opportunity. Let's not waste time. So any loose talk, any false accusation won't help. We can sit here and talk about those issues. We have been talking about those issues for many, many years, for many, many times. It won't help. The problem is how can you possibly seize the opportunity to make a difference? I think the Chinese government is willing to listen, but they are not willing to listen to all kinds of accusations.
What kind of deal do you think they might make?
Well, the first thing is that if you're talking about full autonomy, okay, let's talk about details. What do you mean by full autonomy? What more do you need? Do you need to promote more Tibetans into high-ranking government services in Tibet? What the percentage in terms of language? What percentage of schools should have Tibetan language in their teaching? In terms of economy, in terms of jobs, how many Tibetans should have jobs? All these are details, but any other loose talk probably is not going to help.
Mr. Tsering?
Yeah, can I just challenge the notion that the time is on the side of the Chinese government on this? I think in this problem, both sides have disadvantages with the passing away over time. There is this perception amongst some Chinese leadership that with the passing away of the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan issue will get resolved. That's a very wrong notion. I think it might become a cliche now, but with the Dalai Lama, there's a solution to the problem of Tibet. With his passing away, the Chinese government might lose that one important binding force that the Tibetan people have, and then they might have to deal with what my friend Lobsang calls the radical element, and that is not true in the interest of the Tibetans nor the Chinese. In terms of what Tibetans really want, I don't think this forum is the right forum to say, to sort of negotiate for the Tibetans or the Chinese government, but overall, if the Chinese government feel confident that by providing the Tibetan people with things that matters most to the Tibetan people, our way of life, our tradition, our religion, culture, there can be ways but both sides can accommodate. But right now what is happening is, although there is something called autonomy, whether it's the Tibet Autonomous Region or other Tibetan prefectures or counties, in reality, for example, Tibetan language is getting second-class treatment, even in Lhasa. Unfortunately, when we went there, and I think our delegation in fact informed the Chinese leadership, on paper they say they have to follow a two-language formula, so you have signboards which are in Tibetan and in Chinese. But the Tibetan is so small there that they're just meant for paper, whereas the Chinese signboards, anyone who has visited Lhasa would know. So that's one symbolic indication of how Tibetan language is being respected.
One of the big issues about language is what should be the language of the schools. As I understand, the policy now is that Tibetan language is used primarily in the elementary school, and at the middle schools and higher schools, Mandarin is the main language. I heard that in the 1980s, there were some attempts to have Tibetan used all the way up through the education, but even some of the Tibetans said that we want our children to get Mandarin because they're going to need Mandarin for economic reasons. Lobsang, what's the situation about the language, and what do you think should be done?
Now, Tibetans, you can divide into two groups. One, Tibetans dwelling in urban areas and rural areas. Mm-hmm. In the rural areas where 90% of the Tibetan people live, if they don't use Tibetan language, they cannot be educated in Tibetan language, educated at all, because that's their means of communication, that's the way the family live, and that's how the age-old tradition has been going on. So in urban areas, yes, you will find Tibetans who are interested and willing to learn Chinese language for their own career's sake. However, if you don't preserve the Tibetan language and teach Tibetan language in the rural areas where 90% of Tibetan people live, then you are essentially denying them in education in itself. That's one point. Now, I would like to challenge Shipeng also that time is on the Beijing side. As Pujungla said, with His Holiness Dalai Lama, you have a solution here, a moderate person who can deliver a solution. Otherwise, what will happen with the passing of His Holiness Dalai Lama, his advocacy of nonviolence and peace will go away, and the Tibetan movement will get radicalized. Now, what will happen? Now, if you look at international level, you look at Palestine, North Ireland, East Timor, Kosovo, Bosnia, all these ethnic conflicts happened. One of the common denominator is migration of people from the majority area to the minority area, right? Now, within China too, if you look at Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, there are three Chinese per one Mongolian, and almost like 60% of the population in Xinjiang are Chinese. Now, what is happening in Xinjiang? If you go to Kashgar, that's the second largest city in Kashgar. I was told by a Chinese scholar who was studying at Kennedy School, he said, Han Chinese don't dare venture outside the house in the evening after 6 p.m. Why? Uyghurs, they stab them. Kids throw stones at them. Women spit on them. They say it's unbelievable, so humiliating, so dangerous for Han people to live in Kashgar area. Now, do you want that kind of replication in Tibet as well? And it will happen, because with His Holiness, you have a chance to find a peaceful solution to the whole issue, and His Holiness can deliver it to the Chinese government because he enjoys the loyalty and legitimacy and support of the Tibetan people. Without him, violence is not a question of if, but when. It's inevitable.
In a minute, we're going to throw this open to questions from the audience, and there will be 4 mics. But one final question about time on their side is the question of migrants coming into Lhasa and other parts of Tibet. Xiaozhang, you've been studying that problem. What do you see the situation of the migrants? Is the government of Beijing pushing in migrants so the time will be on the side? Why are migrants coming into Tibet?
I think we have to see the migrants we have to separate the different time. Yeah, I think in the 50s and 60s, the Chinese, the Han people in Tibet, mainly government sent government officials and professionals in that nature. But after the economic reform in the 80s, there was a reverse flow of people. This Han government officials and professionals, a lot of them left Tibet. And then at the same time, there's a different direction of flow of people. There are rural migrants, economic migrants. They go to Tibet to do small business, to work in the city as basically a low-class job. So their situation is similar, like in this country, like Mexico immigrant in the U.S. That's kind of job they were doing. And these people, they were basically marginalized politically and economically. And they were definitely not government agent to have any political agenda set by them. And they were taking the jobs not taken from Tibetans, but they were taking the jobs that urban Tibetans do not want. It's like the city people here in New York, you don't want to do that, those kind of jobs. But a lot of people really afraid, say, just what you see the number. And I do not think, basically, you have to see the economic position, the power of these people. For example, in Lhasa, you do have a lot of migrants, business people, and you do have a lot of urban Tibetans. And these two groups, they are in very unbalanced power. So in that situation, migration in Tibet is not an issue of you have people, then you eliminate cultural identity and ethnic identity, because you have a lot of examples like around the world. Some like minority place, you have other people come in and people worried, and segregation or isolation of one place, it is not the answer of preserving identity. There's different approaches. For example, like in...
I think we're going to have to cut you off. One more sentence, one final sentence, and then we throw it up to the audience. Okay. We now move to the portion of our program where we have 4 microphones, and we will take questions from the audience. If you have a comment that's 1 or 2 sentences long, we will permit that in the guise of first part of a question. If it gets much longer, we may say, what's the question? We also want people to identify themselves as they come to the mic. Start with this mic here, identify yourself, and then what's the question?
Okay, I'm Zhe Zhongli, or MPID students or Kennedy School. Actually, I have been to Tibetan for 2 times, and I have my own observation. That's happened just 3 years ago. I have been there. From my observation, actually now Tibetan is pretty stable in this case. Economically and socially, I think everything now become much better. There is some problem happening in 1980s from my knowledge, but in 1990s, everything there is good. So from my observation, that's maybe not a good news to exile group because they lose their bases there. That's one of the important reasons there. And in this dialogue, I think it's helpful, but there is also a lot of...
What's the question? Okay, now comes the question.
My question is that Mr. Senge have said that there is thousands of Tibetans flee to India. How to define flee? Second, you say there is no people flee to Shanghai. Could you please tell me how many Tibetan businessmen in Shanghai and in Beijing?
I would like to challenge your observation that Tibetans are enjoying economic and cultural autonomy. To say that Tibetans are enjoying autonomy is to trying to convince someone the earth is flat. The fact that thousands of Tibetans fleeing Tibet, as I said, it's an evidence enough that everything is not all right in Tibet. Now, as for Chinese going to Tibet and observing, it'll be a little long answer, but I'll be brief. You know, in Chinese, there's a word.
Excuse me. Would you please believe in what's the meaning of fleet?
Flee?
Fleet, yeah.
They
what's the meaning?
literally illegally, they cross border without permission. They walk Himalayan mountains, in the snow-capped mountains. They lose their fingers, hands. They walked without the permission of the Chinese government, because Chinese government doesn't allow them to go freely to most of them. Hence they cross. So that's literally flee, running away from your home, from your family. Now, as for your observation, I would like to caution all the Chinese people, even Americans who go to Tibet and say everything is all right because I saw so, you know. Because in Chinese there's a word called Tungo Ren, right? Tungo Ren, which is inclusive of Tibetan, Mongolian, and Han Chinese. So when Chinese ask a Tibetan, Nishi Tungo Rema, the Tibetan is likely to say, how?
I think that's
Yeah,
to
but why?
question. I have
Because-
a second question. Do you know that?
Just a minute, he
Okay.
has the stage at the moment.
Because that's a politically correct thing to say. Yes, I am Tungo Ren. But if American asks a Tibetan the same question in English, are you Chinese? The answer will be subtly different. He will say, I am Tibetan from China. But if you ask in Tibetan, Kera Gemi Yimbe, that is, are you Chinese? He will say, me, no, I am Tibetan. Why? The term Tungo Ren, there is not even a single word in Tibetan language that's equivalent or similar to the word Tungo Ren. So when Chinese goes to Tibet and talk to Tibetan, you should not expect Tibetans to, you should not believe whatever Tibetan is saying is the original or genuine feeling, because you cannot communicate in their language. So unless you are a Tibetan speaking Tibetan language and asking them the question, you will not get true answer. So that goes to all the Chinese who have been to Tibet and to all the Americans who have been to Tibet. So I have met thousands of Tibetans, you know, who have come to India. We meet them on a regular basis. We know the situation in Tibet very, very well, actually.
Can I just add one thing?
Very brief, very
I
brief.
think the issue about stability in Tibet today, we can just see how the situation is if we go by a Chinese official report on, I think, November 13 or 14, where they had staged a counter-terrorist exercise in Lhasa. Now, if Tibet is stable and everything, I don't think the officials need to be doing something like that.
Xiao Zhang.
I think the Lobsang only pointed to the one direction of the population flow. Every year, thousands of people cross border go to India, but there's also a lot of people cross border go back to Tibet, to Tibet Autonomous Region. And also, if you make the case to say because Dalai Lama is in India, so people go. But actually, a lot of people use India as a jump board and come to America to earn dollars, and to the point. And there's not only go through India, but many other routes go to America, to the point that the U.S. consulate in Chengdu right now recognize this problem using Tibet political issue as a way of coming to America to earn dollars, and they right now systematically deny visa from certain area, because that's the situation was pretty bad using this. So right now they systematically deny entry visa of Tibetans come to the States.
That is
Next
true
question.
with Chinese as well.
Yeah. So that
All
many illegal Chinese come to America, but it's come to make dollars and then send back to home. It's not what you think of the political issues.
Next question.
Thanks. My name is Herman Lu. I'm a second-year student here in Kennedy School. I grew up in Yunnan province, and that is a province in China which has the biggest number of ethnic minorities. We had more than 2,000. Since
2 million. 2 million.
Pardon me?
More than 2 million, I think.
More than 2,000.
2 dozen.
Yes.
I'm sorry, 2 dozen types.
Yes.
Okay.
And I have enjoyed the ethnic diversity in my home province. And I spent the past 10 years in United States. I think this country really benefit from the racial diversity after we broken up the segregation. My question to Mr. Sangay's, like by recreating those type of racial segregation, even like in the administrative level or in the like mentality level, do you think the ethnical like group is going to really benefit or it will be hurt from those segregation?
Do you advocate segregation, or do you advocate, say, if the Tibetans are a majority of a certain area in Sichuan, that would all become under Tibetan rule, and that the Nahan would then become a minority in that area? What is your...
Actually, your question subtext, I can see these, kind of somewhat paranoia, because whenever we say Tibetans want a single administrative unit, you promptly think, oh, Tibetans are going to barricade themselves, they will build great wall, and they're going to have a living museum of Tibetan people isolating everybody else. No, what Tibetans are saying is that we are capable of modernizing, we are capable of changing our own culture, we are capable of developing our own homeland, but we will do it on our terms. That's the point. When I say single administrative unit, all we are saying is that as far as Tibetan people are concerned, the final say should be with the Tibetan people. Again, having said that, it doesn't mean I'm friendly with lots of Chinese people. I can be friendly with them. Chinese can come and go, but it will be the Tibetan people who will determine what is in the best interest and how many Chinese can be accommodated within the economic and environmental parameter of the Tibetan society. That's the point, So we are not going to segregate everybody. When you say His Holiness Dalai Lama accepts Chinese constitution as the parameter, he's not going to accept independence, then the whole paranoia having a great wall segregation should not be the way to look at it. Diversity, we want diversity. We will tolerate diversity. We will encourage diversity. We will implement diversity. We will welcome Chinese people, those who want to come and invest, do business, those who want to come and worship in our temples. We will welcome them, but it will be us who will determine what is in our best interest. That's the problem. And all we are asking on the Chinese part is that you should recognize that Tibetan people are distinct in their language, culture, the way they speak, the way they dress, even the way they eat food is distinct from Chinese. You should respect that distinction. You should acknowledge the distinction. At the moment, the problem is, in a nutshell, is that Chinese government tell us what to do, what not to do. In a monastery, there is Democratic Management Committee who will determine how many monks can be in and out. Economic policies are drafted in Beijing, implemented in Lhasa. All we are saying is get our feedback, get our cooperation, and then we can live peacefully ever after.
So does that mean we should break my home province into 2,000 pieces?
Pardon?
Does that mean we should break my home province, which is Yunnan, into 2,000 pieces?
Not necessarily so, but for example, China is comfortable with breaking up Hong Kong, special economic Hong Kong, one country, two system, Macau, special economic zones, Chongqing. They have already broken up Xinjiang as a separate unit, Inner Mongolia as a separate unit, Zhuang as a separate unit. Tibet is also a separate unit. It's just that the rest of the Tibet is divided. So Chinese government has already divided or segregated these ethnic groups and according to their needs.
But aren't you advocating a greater degree of local political autonomy than exists in those other places?
That is definitely true. For following reasons, because Tibetan people are the only people, who were included, who were occupied or made part of China after 1949. That's the Tibetan distinctness, right? Two, in 1951, Tibetan government and Chinese government signed an agreement called 17-point agreement, which essentially has the spirit of one country, two system. The Tibetan people will have local administrative and political power. But all these were violated. So Tibetans were already provided before in the 17-point agreement, and we were the last people to be included as part of China. Hence, we have a distinct entitlement, and Chinese government should respect that. That's all we're asking for.
I think I can see here where some of the Chinese people in Beijing would find some of these points quite difficult to accept. Isn't that right, Xiaozhang? Do you want to comment on that? Sure.
Well, just one comment. You mean?
Yeah.
I think if the Mongols were sitting here, probably they would make the same argument. If the Manchus were sitting here, they would make the same arguments. Actually, as a Shanghainese, I would make the same arguments. I said, we Shanghai don't welcome any outsiders. We Shanghai for Shanghainese only, no outsiders, but Shanghai has been taken over by outsiders and by foreigners, so for the good of Shanghai.
Next question.
That's a tough act to follow. My name is Peter Crawley, and just a concerned citizen, I guess. My question has to do with the timeline of the Dalai Lama's stay and status in India, and whether or not it has any finite timeline, and what role the Indian government might play in the return of the Dalai Lama to Tibet.
Who wants that, Mr. Tsering?
Yes, in 1959, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama crossed over into India, the Indian government welcomed him, not just the government, the people, and they have treated him as a guest. The government of India poses no restriction on His Holiness. They welcome him as long as he feels the time is right, or as long as there's no solution to the Tibetan issue. In terms of the Indian government's role in a solution, that's interesting, because historically and geographically, if you look at the map of the region there, India has a great stake in what the future of Tibet should be and will be. So therefore, the government of India has provided a foundation for the Tibetan people at a critical time in our life to promote and preserve our culture and identity in exile. The government of India, we believe, will continue to assist us in that endeavor, and maybe be more proactive in terms of staking its claim, staking its interest in the possible solution on Tibet. But if I may go back to some of the issues
briefly
raised. Yeah, I think from here it's very clear, from some of the issues raised earlier, it's very clear that the Dalai Lama has been able to not only reach out to the Chinese leadership, he has also been able to reach out to the Tibetan people to accept his proposal for a future of Tibet. In the case of the Chinese leadership, I think they are yet to fully bring in the Chinese people into their perspective for a possible solution. Therefore, we have all these questions as to, are you asking for greater Tibet? Are you asking for separation? Are you asking for division? I think if the Chinese people are made aware of what the future of Tibet, which according to His Holiness the Dalai Lama would be, I think there will be less problems, less confusion, less misconception. Unfortunately, that's not happened.
Can I just
these people have been waiting patiently, and I haven't noticed because of the lights, the mic's up here. So this mic, and then we're coming to you. Yes.
Yes, my name is Doug Schlemmer. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. I have a migration question. It's my understanding that there are government incentives to entice Han Chinese to migrate to Tibet. My question is, why do these incentives exist? Is this to bolster the domestic economy, or is this a form of cultural imperialism?
Xiaozhang?
I think people often confuse these two kind of group of people. There are indeed incentives from the government to send government officials to go to Tibet, and because the reason have the incentive because government officials do not want to go to Tibet. And there was in terms of the other group of migrants, the economic migrants, rural migrants who go there to do business, they did not have any incentive. Actually, they had a lot of restrictions go to Tibet in the past. And these years, it was like an ease on those restrictions, but it was not in the form of incentive. And of course, you can say ease of restriction is kind of incentive, but I think that's not. I think that is a different issue. It's not an active incentive.
Isn't it true, Xiaozhang, that there has been government funding into Tibet for economic development, and that those opportunities would attract people from the others, but that's an indirect incentive and not a direct.
Yes.
Lapsang?
Can I quickly respond to someone advocating independence for Shanghai? He says that Shanghai is ruled by foreigners, but every newspaper you read is that Chinese politics is dominated by Shanghai faction. In the standing committee of the Politburo, 9 of the 9 members, 5 are from Shanghai. Same in the Politburo, and same in the Central Committee. I think Shanghai, as a small city, has too much power in China. But Tibetans are not asking that. All we are asking is that in Tibet Autonomous Region, the party secretary is the the most powerful person. But we have never had a Tibetan party secretary in the last 40 years. All we are asking for is, when you have autonomous region of Tibet, the party secretary should be a Tibetan person. That's all we are asking for. We don't want 5 members in the central committee, the standing committee of the Politburo. All we want is 1 party secretary in Tibet.
I think if that is the only thing you ask for, that would be much easier to solve this problem.
To begin with.
Sure thing.
Being a little bit Shanghai chauvinistic, I have to say that Shanghai is not a small city by any imagination. Shanghai is a city of 16 million people. Then to answer your question, I think in this age of globalization, sometimes when you are talking about becoming part of the world, becoming integrated with the world economy, becoming modernized, industrialized, you have to give up a little bit in order to get a little bit. A lot of Chinese today are no longer drinking tea; they are drinking Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola. I mean, is American cultural imperialism? I don't think so. I think that's good. A lot of them are drinking Starbucks coffees. They love to drive BMWs, not Chinese red flag cars. So.
Next question.
My name is Xu Dong. I'm a second-year Kennedy School student. I want to put a question to our panelists, that if, to our 2 Tibetan friends, if you can choose freely, do you choose Tibetan independence or choosing to be part of China? If your answer is yes for independence, do you think economically is it a viable model? Is it beneficial for Tibetan to be independent or to be part of China? Thanks.
Lobsang?
If you are given a choice, you are saying...
if you are given a free choice without any if you can choose freely, what do you choose?
It's like, it's obvious. You are asking, do you want Rolls-Royce or Honda? Obviously, I'll take Rolls-Royce, right? But then the question was, that's true. Can you sustain economically, right? That assumes that Tibetan people may not be able to sustain economically. Tibet, as a homeland, as an area, as a nation, has survived, has sustained for the last 2,000 years on its own, irrespective of economic development. Can we sustain? We survive for 2,000 years. Why can't we sustain? We might be poorer than Sichuan, but can we sustain? Perhaps we can. And one example why we can sustain is that Tibetans in exile, right? They are called Jews of South Asia or Lebanese of North Africa because they're doing so successfully as far as business is concerned. So we have we have many entrepreneurs, who are capable of doing. And then if you all go back, if Tibetan people are given a choice, I think they will do very well economically as well.
Yes. I can say, I think it's not a matter of whether we have a choice or not. I think it's a matter of what is your right. I think we Tibetans have a right to an independent Tibet. But the Dalai Lama is not asking that. He says he's looking to the future. He's saying that it's in the interest of the Tibetans and the Chinese themselves to look at a framework which guarantees the Tibetans the best possible situation. And that is the right question, I think, at this point of time.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that now they may negotiate to be part of China, but that the long-run aim is to become completely independent?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if you look at history, again, there's a Chinese perspective and Tibetan perspective. We Tibetans believe that we were historically independent. And we are, so from our point of view, we feel so. Therefore, when His Holiness reached out to the Chinese leadership, I think from the Tibetan side, they even tell him that he sold out to the Chinese, although I don't believe that. I think he was more sort of forward-looking in coming out with this solution. And he's quite sincere in this.
Next question.
My name is Esmani from Kennedy School. I have a question for Mr. Sengay. You mentioned a number of times Hong Kong and also spoke highly of the one country, two system model. Would you put this model to the negotiation table from your side, from your point of view? I ask the question because the Chinese government has used or put forward this model as a means to resolve the question of Taiwan.
I think so, yeah. I mean, one country system is one model that both Chinese and Tibetans should consider, As far, given the realistic situation of Tibet is compared to Taiwan, we feel that one country, two system is perhaps a better option compared to what we have now.
Let me make sure I understand. For example, in Hong Kong, you have a separate judicial system that's different from the judicial system in China. Are you advocating that the political structure also of Tibet could also be a different kind of system?
within the general framework of one country, two system, you can have an institutional arrangement, which will suit the interests of Tibetan people. For example, Tibetans, the emphasis will be more on culture, for example, and administration. So accordingly, we can make an institutional arrangement. We don't have to copycat or imitate, replicate Hong Kong model per se in detail, We can make institutional arrangement, I think.
Next question.
My name is Pekka Mykkänen. I'm a Nieman Fellow from Finland. I have a feeling that there's been less pressure on the Chinese government on human rights policies since September 11th. And for instance, putting the ETIM, the East Turkestan independent movement, to the terrorist list has given this new sense of friendship between China and United States. And at the same time, I have a feeling that the human rights situation has somehow gotten worse in Xinjiang due to the war on terrorism that China is now fighting alongside with the United States. I'd like to ask, do you see any connection with September 11th and the way China feels of itself right now, perhaps more relaxed, less American pressure, and has it had any impact on human rights situation in Tibet?
Xiping, do you want to answer that?
Well, first of all, I think the pressure, the outside pressure on China regarding human rights, in my view, has never worked. It has worked in releasing a few dissidents, but that's a very small progress, if you will. It has never worked, and I think certainly since September 11th, I think human rights record all over the world, including the United States, is getting worse. And therefore, I think no one's really talking about human rights anymore. Everyone's talking about terrorism. So anyone is trying to do anything is possibly suspicious of becoming a terrorist. And you're right that because the current situation, U.S.-China relations is in the views of Colin Powell and in the views of many others, is very good. It is the best in many, many years. I think the Chinese government certainly is more confident about handling this U.S.-China relations and handling many other issues. I think you're absolutely right that this is the big background is the anti-war, anti-terror.
Mr. Tsering?
Yes, at least in the case of the Tibetan people, I should say that international pressure works in helping the human rights situation better in Tibet. Just last year, we had, I think, 3 prominent Tibetan political prisoners released because of American pressure. Not just released, they were even sent to the United States. So it does work. And in the case of the post-9/11 situation, initially the Chinese authorities did try to put the Tibetans also in the same bracket of terrorism thing. But it was transparent to the whole international community that the Dalai Lama represents no terrorist or non-violent threat to the Chinese leadership. On the other hand, the Eastern Turkestan people, the Xinjiang people, they were unfortunate that they don't have a leader like the Dalai Lama, and so they got sort of bracketed into that situation.
We'll have time for 2 or 3 more questions if we keep it brief, and then I will have a couple sentences from each person at the end, give each person an opportunity to respond in general. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lyndon Chow. I'm a first-year MPS student here in Kennedy School. My question is addressed to Mr. Sangay. You talk about the possibility of the rise of radical elements once Dalai Lama passed away. Are you talking about terrorist act? If that being the case, if the radical elements within this movement try to use terrorist act to achieve its political ends, what kind of impact will this bring to your cause? Thanks.
What I was saying is that because Dalai Lama has advocated nonviolence all along, I consider nonviolence as the preferred option, the best option for both sides. However, despite persistent efforts by His Holiness Dalai Lama to have a nonviolent, peaceful resolution to the Tibet issue, if Chinese government doesn't reciprocate, right, you compel Tibetans to resort to conventional national struggles. I say this not because Tibetan people desire violence, not at all. What I say is that because they'll be so desperate, they'll be so pushed to the corner. And why I say this also, look at all the ethnic conflicts around the world. In Xinjiang and in Tibet, it's inevitable it will happen. Now, having said that, I don't mean to say violence will succeed. I don't think so. but it will be chaotic, it will be messy, like we have in Xinjiang, where Han Chinese cannot roam around freely in the evening of Kashgar area. So therefore, it is not in the best interest of both the Chinese government and the Tibetan people to, to just let the situation develop into that kind of scenario. Hence, at this moment, when Dalai Lama is advocating peaceful means to resolve the issue, peace should be the preferred way, and there should be reciprocity from the Chinese government side and resolve the issue peacefully.
Sangye, let me make sure I understand the situation. If the Dalai Lama were to pass away, then, as I understand, the reincarnation, some child would be selected by the Tibetans, and then presumably the Chinese would select someone also who would not be acceptable to certainly the Tibetans outside. So you would have a rival of the two young Tibetans. Isn't that the way the situation would be?
Now, I can broaden the question if I may. There is general kind of theory that with the passing away of the Dalai Lama, Tibetan issue or Tibetan movement will fizzle away. That's general theory because it's so difficult to recuperate, because it's difficult to get charismatic leader like Dalai Lama. But I would like to argue otherwise. Why? Because in exile, we have a governmental system which we are planning, which we are establishing to have both kind of a dual structure with spiritual legitimacy as well as democratic legitimacy. Let me explain what I mean by that.
Very quickly.
Very briefly. Since 1960, we have been electing our member of parliament. Since 1990, parliament elects the cabinet. Since 2000, we elect our prime minister. So after 6 or 7 terms of prime minister, we feel that we can institutionalize the post and power and function of the prime minister, and his function will be consolidated. So we will have a democratic setup as far as political power and administration is concerned. However, we will have a spiritual leader who will be our spiritual as well as moral leader, like the King of Thailand, And do we have a person who can fit in the very big shoes of His Holiness Dalai Lama? Potentially, yes. His name is Karmapa. But he is unique because he was endorsed both by the Chinese government and the Dalai Lama. While he was in Tibet, he was very popular. His mystical figure, iconic, legendary myth surrounding the aura of being someone special surrounds him, And then what happened? He dared Chinese government and he defected to India to be with His Holiness Dalai Lama. Hence his popularity shot up. He is so popular among Tibetans inside Tibet and outside Tibet. Hence we have a ready-made leader, thanks to Chinese government, to fill in the shoes of Dalai Lama. Now, can he be as charismatic and articulate as Dalai Lama? It's difficult, but possible. Why? Dalai Lama was also trained in these 2,500 years of Buddhist tradition, and Karmapa is also undergoing similar training. And with time, we hope that he will become as charismatic and popular leader like Dalai Lama. So if Chinese government is thinking that with the passing of the Dalai Lama, Tibet issue will fizzle out, I don't think so. We will have both democratic setup as well as spiritual legitimacy to carry on the Tibetan movement and the Tibetan government exile. So there is very big hope.
Final question.
I'm Kate Wheeler. I'm an independent writer and concerned citizen also, and I have a question for Dr. Sheng. If you've said that it seems that time and all the cards are on the side of the Chinese government, what could the government hear that would persuade them to grant additional concessions of autonomy other than a list of how many jobs, or is that really it, or would there be something that the government actually wants from this exchange?
You mean the government here, you mean the government of the United States?
No, the Chinese government.
What's
your impression what would make them happy to negotiate? What could they additionally receive?
What are the conditions that would make better negotiation and make them more willing to negotiate?
You were hoping there would, what can you give us?
I asked the Dalai Lama this very question about 4 or 3 years ago. He answered that if I go back to China, I think it will promote harmony between the Tibetans in China and the Chinese in China, and then we will be a big family. I thought that was a great idea, but that's a little bit general, it's a little bit vague. Great harmony, of course. But I think the Chinese government probably at this moment does not see any real benefit, but they do see a lot of risks by opening the door, by welcoming Dalai Lama to go back to Beijing, and that's why I'm saying that they have all the cards. And you can talk about all those things, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and you are going to waste this opportunity. And
what would make them do something more with this opportunity and to try to push it to resolution?
Well, you have to. I think we met the Dalai Lama about 2 months ago, and my sense from his talk at Harvard was that probably the Dalai Lama needs probably someone like a prime minister who pays attention to details, who knows all the stuff, who has the full confidence of the Dalai Lama, who has the support of all the Tibetans in exile, who can really represent Tibetans as a whole to negotiate with Chinese, so that he will present, these are our conditions, our concessions, our demands, our requests. Can you meet some of them? Can you meet all of them? Right now, I just cannot find one that I think the Chinese government can talk to. Or probably not to make fun of this great scholar who was originally here, is that you need someone like Harry Kissinger, to go to China in 1971.
We have, yeah. We now have time for about a couple sentences from each of the speakers. Xiaozhang, do you including comment? Not required, but you're offered the opportunity.
I think so far on the Tibetan side, the goal, which is negotiation, and the strategy, which so far all these years has been demonstration and protest, these two things mismatched. And I think on the China side, there's calculation of benefit and risk. I think there should be broader understanding of this benefit and risk. So I think if both sides adjust their strategy and go a little bit better, I think we have a better chance to reach agreement.
Lapsang?
I would like to assure Zhang Shipeng that we have plenty of Kissingers if given a chance by the Chinese government. We are willing to negotiate with the Chinese government whenever, wherever they want. All they need to do is send us an email. We'll be there. What are the benefits for the Chinese government? There are plenty of benefits. For example, I met recently Chinese friends who said he is so embarrassed to walk around America because when you say I'm Chinese, they look down upon you. They say, oh, your human rights situation in Tibet is horrible, all that thing. It say, I can't walk around. It says it's an embarrassment for us. So if you resolve the issue of Tibet, it brings a good image to the Chinese people and China as a whole. And China knows better. China should know better because they suffered under Japanese imperialism and British imperialism, right? 150 years of humiliation. They have been a victim themselves. So they should know how Tibetans feel. We feel exactly like Chinese felt towards Japanese and British imperialists. Now, being a victim yourself, you should know that you should not use your victimhood to victimize others. Rather, you should take that as a lesson to be more generous, to be more graceful, to be more nice to Tibetan people, And then there are other benefits, that's one. Other benefits, like if you resolve the issue of Tibet, and it attracts, it shows that at international level, China is changing, China is reforming, And then it's good, perhaps it might give an incentive for people in Hong Kong to look favorably to Tibet, people in Taiwan to reconsider their hardened options, And perhaps Hu Jintao will get Nobel Peace Prize as well and become the first Han Chinese to be recognized by the Chinese government to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Mr. Tsering.
I think this is a historic opportunity for the new Chinese leadership as well as the Tibetan leadership to reach on a possible solution. And I think it's hopeful signs are there with the envoys of the Dalai Lama meeting Chinese leaders. I want to reiterate the fact that the Dalai Lama is very sincere in this whole effort based on the commitment that Deng Xiaoping gave to him in 1979. He has fulfilled his part of the commitment. The Chinese government is apparently, as we heard from our friends here, desirous of continuing the process. We want to see concrete action which will lead to a solution in the near future. And waiting for the Dalai Lama to pass away as a solution is no solution. I've referred to the issues that might be there in the past, but more importantly, if you go by strictly Tibetan spiritual process, by May passing away of this Dalai Lama in exile, it doesn't mean the Chinese authorities will get to choose the next Dalai Lama. It's based on the theory of transmigration of souls, where we believe these enlightened beings have their right to be reborn as they want to. And the Dalai Lama has said very concretely, publicly, that if he passes away in exile, he has his task unfinished, and therefore he will not be born in Chinese hands. And I think with him, we have a way of assuring stability and territorial integrity for the People's Republic of China. And therefore, I think this is the best period for the Tibetans and the Chinese people. And my feeling is that the Chinese people should encourage the Chinese government, because right now I feel the Chinese people haven't really been doing that.
Xiping?
Well, I think whatever we talk about here probably will be conveyed to Beijing one way or the other, directly or indirectly. I hope that the message that leaders in Beijing get from this forum is not too discouraging. I hope that they will not be too foolish to believe that the Tibetans in exile have just one voice, and whoever speaks represents the entire Tibetans. I hope that they are smart enough to realize there are many voices in the Tibetan in exile, and the real one is the Dalai Lama, and probably the best one is someone, as I said, like Henry Kissinger, who the Dalai Lama nominates and who can really negotiate. And I think the Chinese government probably should look forward to finding or seeing someone like that.
We haven't resolved the negotiation, but I think we've done a lot to clarify them. And please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you very much.